Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Andreas Krieg, Director of MENA Analytica and Associate Professor at the School of Security Studies at King's College London. Dr. Krieg, thanks so much for joining us.
Great pleasure. Good afternoon.
Wonderful. Well, lots to talk about. Let's start with a question on the energy markets that has sort of not puzzled everyone, but again has been explained as plentiful supply. But any disruption to, oil supplies, energy flows, we've seen a lot of redirection in the last 2-3 years because of the Russia-Ukraine war, because of certain sensitivities around choke points like the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandab. But we haven't seen any real physical disruption. Do you think the oil and energy markets should continue to believe that that will be the case, despite all the geopolitical noise that we've seen more recently, just in the last couple of days?
I'm slightly optimistic. I think the overall trend here is one of of engagement, of de-escalation, particularly when it comes to Iran and when it comes to, which I think is the kind of, the elephant in the room. If if the Gulf states in particular, if the United States want to have a deal with Iran, and that seems to be the case at the moment, then I'd say this is kind of the overall picture for de-escalation. I think the only spoiler at the moment is probably the Netanyahu government, who doesn't want a deal with Iran in any shape or form. I think if you look, and I think what has changed over the last, in comparison to 2-3 years ago, I'd say, first of all, the GCC states do want a deal with Iran. I think the Saudis in particular are at a point now where they're embracing a deal with Iran, despite all the risks that come with it. We see even the UAE saying that, despite all the rhetoric and all the caution when it comes to Iran, I think they're also saying that, for us, it's best if we have a deal, because further escalation doesn't help anyone. It risks national security, undermines the, economic security, supply chains and whatnot. And on top of that, we have a U.S. government with Trump and Witkoff, who are the two key shapers when it comes to U.S. foreign and security policy in the Middle East, who are also saying we prefer having a deal over military escalation. So that overall is a good sort of context in which I think, at least for energy markets, we'll see less disruption potentially. The only issue is obviously that a new JCPOA, as we see it coming, being negotiated at the moment, is probably mostly focused or almost exclusively focused on the nuclear program, and not very much on the proxy operations that the Iranians are involved in. Hence, it doesn't directly affect the Houthis, which is Bab el-Mandab, and it might not affect, Hezbollah or, some of the militias in Iraq, who the Iranians control, who continue to disrupt and operate in areas that are extremely relevant for energy markets. And so there could be a concern, but I do think that once the Iranians see a pathway to lifting sanctions, they'll do everything they can to kind of contribute to regional stability, and that will obviously be positive for energy markets.
Yeah, I mean, but as you mentioned, the spanner in the works seems to be the Israeli equation, because the US may be pushing for a deal with Iran. Saudis, as you said, are very keen to sort of restart that sort of détente that was going a couple of years ago and then got stalled for obvious reasons. But so how do you see that circle being squared, if you like? Because what is the US in a position to do? It doesn't seem to be succeeding in de-escalating what Israel is doing. Is that ruining its plans, or how do you see that going forward, realistically speaking?
Well, my concern is more widely with the Trump administration. It all comes down to Washington in the end of the day. Although I'd say, in comparison to maybe 10 years ago, I think the Gulf has a lot more agency. Gulf states have more agency. If they want to engage with Iran and forge a relationship, which they have done, most importantly, Saudi has done, that will stand on its own feet. But obviously, Washington matters in that respect. And the problem is Trump doesn't have a vision as a president. He doesn't understand the region. He doesn't have good advisors. I mean, Witkoff is a businessman. He's not someone who understands geopolitics. but he seems to be a deal maker, and he seems to be on Trump's side when it comes to a de-escalation. My concern is all the other figures, the MAGA people or the non-MAGA people, actually, because you could make a case that MAGA, making America great again, this agenda suggests that it is about disengagement from the Middle East, making sure the Middle East sorts out its own problems. It also means not
Mm.
giving unequivocal support for Israel whenever Israel needs to or wants to. It's about U.S. interests first. But it's these other people. It's people like Marco Rubio. It's the just fired National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who is who was kind of a hawk who's been pushing for more escalation, taking a pro-Israel stance. And it's all these pro-Israel networks in Washington, all the think tanks and these sort of
Yeah, that
experts.
hasn't changed. Yeah.
No,
What
it
do you
hasn't.
expect
And
to
this
come out of the visit to the Middle East in the next week or two? We do have a big delegation coming, don't we? And what are the expectations on both sides from Saudi and from the US in that regard?
Look, we don't. Again, Trump himself is primarily concerned of what makes him look good. So
Yeah.
domestically, MAGA, it's all about what investments can he secure from the Gulf. Saudi, Qatar, UAE, they have a portfolio of investments that they're going to announce. That is something that will create headlines in the US that will make Trump look good. But second of all, we shouldn't forget that I think the Gulf is providing something to the United States without which the United States cannot exist, without MEGA cannot exist, because MEGA requires partners in the Gulf to bear the burden of conflict and statecraft. And we've seen that all along. I mean, the Qataris are mediating, obviously, in Gaza. They're kind of helping in Syria. And also in Iran. We have the Omanis contributing to that as well, mediating with Iran. We've got the Emiratis, obviously, with their financial networks, supply chains, logistics, and so on, supporting as well, and obviously kind of a leader in AI in the region. We've got the Saudis engaged with the Iranians, and we got the Saudis also mediating between the US and Russia. So there's a lot going on, and I see that Washington has delegated a lot of statecraft to the region, so they cannot live without the Gulf states. And I
Mm.
think that's an important development, which means they also have leverage over Trump. They have leverage to tell Trump, look, on Gaza in particular, we need you to do X, Y, and Z. On Iran, we would prefer you to do X, Y, and Z. And that kind of again why I'm mildly positive that that it's about de-escalation with Iran at the moment, even if Israel is pushing against it.
And do you think that Iran has an appetite to do a deal on the nuclear issue per se? You mentioned the JCPOA. I mean, essentially taking us back to the Obama deal that was done. Some observers are saying, no, it's not going to rush into that. And what would it take, because obviously of the, uncertainty over, well, Trump could change his mind even if he promises X, Y, Z. I mean, what would it take to move the dial on that particular deal, do you think?
We're very early days.
Mm,
There is a willingness on all sides, including on the Iranian side, for a deal. The Iranians prefer a deal only on the nuclear program. They don't want to talk about missiles. They don't want to talk about proxy operations, the axis of resistance. They don't want to do any of that. And Trump is happy with a deal because that's what he cares about, a deal, whatever the content of that deal might be. Then if we're at an early stage of a framework of what are the boundaries of dialogue actually, what are we discussing actually? That's where we are just agreeing on what we can possibly discuss, not even about what could a deal look like. And then I think you start small. You start with a nuclear program. There seems to be the biggest overlap in terms of a Venn diagram on both sides. And then you build it up. You build it up over, what are the sort of extensions of that? What else can we discuss? And once there is trust, and that's the problem, there's no trust on both sides.
yeah.
The Iranians don't trust the Americans don't trust the Iranians. And I think here again, the Gulf states will be in the position where they can build trust and sort of create room for maneuver. And I think that's where, Saudi, Qatar, Oman, potentially even the Emiratis can come in to kind of say in Washington, look, this is the way ahead, and we're willing to help you build a relationship.
And I mean, where does China fall into this in terms of its relationship with the Gulf and with the Gulf states? And also, of course, in the backdrop of this, tariff spat with the US, which is, arguably being initiated by the US mostly. But does China play any sort of behind the scenes role in the Middle East, do you think, anymore? Or is it busier, with the South China Sea and its trade issues?
Problem with China is they've been free riding all along, and they're still free riding when it comes to this part of the world. They don't have the capacity or capability yet to really project force. I mean, it's for them, it's all about trade, and they're obviously a trade superpower, but they don't have the capabilities that the United States or even other Western countries have in terms of projecting strategic depth in this part of the world. And so the Chinese have been free riding even on the Iran-Saudi deal. I mean, they mediated something that the
Yeah.
US initiated, that the Iraqis were mediating, and they were jumping onto the bandwagon at 1 minute before midnight, and then claimed the victory. And that's kind of how they do it, but they don't have genuine relationships. These are relationships which are important. Look, I mean, when it comes to Saudi, UAE, Qatar, I mean, the Gulf states, most of their money they're making in Asia now, which means China is important. It's important to kind of
Of course.
for prosperity. But beyond that, it's not a genuine, deep, deep-seated emotional relationship where there is. I don't think there's any love lost on China, and I think that's where Western soft power is still very, very important, and particularly the US is very important in terms of if the West dictates something, and dictate might be the wrong word, but if they kind of give a strategic vision for something, that's where the Gulf will lean towards, because China doesn't have a real vision. It's all very vague and ambiguous, and they don't understand the Middle East as sort of intimately as the West does.
Okay, well that's interesting. That last observation. I mean, maybe they haven't been as involved, but they're as you said, they're long-term sort of thinkers and planners. What about Russia, Dr. Krieg? Because of course it's had traditionally a big role in the Middle East. I mean, more on the sort of proxy side, if you like. It was in Syria, now it's out of there. It's obviously it has a relationship with Iran as well. Do you think that the Ukraine equation has and what developments that we've seen in Syria most recently in the last few months has essentially taken Russia out of the Middle East equation from a geopolitical standpoint? It's too busy
It's
dealing with
certainly,
its own thing.
I think Syria has strategically weakened them, but let's not forget, I mean, the biggest for us in Europe, at least, the greatest threat from Russia in outside of Ukraine is in Libya and in North Africa. That's kind of their bridgehead. That has been the bridgehead for their operations across the African continent. And that still is a very, very important bridgehead. And Africa is still Russian territory. And we see a lot of, relationship between Africa and the Middle East. We're seeing quite a lot happening also via the UAE. They have proxy partners in the region that are extremely important. And the Russians know how to play it. And the Russians, they're not playing the same game that the Americans are playing. They're not trying to play, superpower. They're trying to carve out their own spaces and niches where they have a competitive advantage. But again, they are obviously the capability completely undermined in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East because of Ukraine. So they're very much limited in terms of what they can do, and that in itself is obviously something where I would say that the Russians will have to take a step back. But even in Syria, I don't think everything is lost. I think the al-Shara regime has said if the Russians want to come back, if they want to have a base, we're happy to negotiate. And then there is the energy side of things as well. I mean, Russia is still extremely important in OPEC Plus. They're extremely important when it comes to gas. And so here again, the Gulf states want to have a positive relationship, and that's the UAE, that's Qatar, that's Saudi. All of them want to have a relationship with Russia, and they're doing what they can to kind of keep a neutral balance. And so, yes, a lot of love for the West, but that doesn't mean they're going to jump on, and they haven't really jumping on the Western bandwagon when it comes to Ukraine.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned OPEC. Of course, I mean, Russia has been in that OPEC Plus group now for a few years. Admittedly, maybe overproducing like a few other members, but Saudi and the OPEC group have been saying what's the most important thing is cohesion. We're going to stick together to manage and balance the market. We've seen a lot of developments in the energy markets in the last couple of months in terms of price, and a lot of back to the sort of US equation and Saudi relationship. The market is trying to interpret what's behind the Saudi-led OPEC volume increases, amidst a sort of weakening demand scenario. And many are saying it is about the Saudi-US relation. It's about the security aspect. It's Saudis doing the US a favor by lowering prices in return for continuous security guarantees, essentially. Which is that the way you see it? We saw the US trying to get out of the Middle East a few years ago, and now it's been pulled back in for various reasons. Where do you think the Saudi point of view is that in terms of its oil policy and what it's trying to achieve geopolitically with that?
the Saudis have a lot of bargaining power in various domains, and one of the domains is energy, and they're using it with the United States, obviously, to get concessions when it comes to security. They want to have a defense deal. It's about getting access to, U.S. markets as well. And obviously, energy is kind of one of the levers that the Saudis are playing against, also in favor of the Americans against the Russians. But I think it's more than that. I think the Saudis are also competing. And when it comes to energy, that's kind of the backbone, obviously, of national security, prosperity, stability in the kingdom. And they will not just sell this out just to do someone a favor. I mean, it's all, in the end of the day, it's all interest driven. And I think at the moment, if they're producing more, keeping prices low, that is something that in the short term will hurt Saudi Arabia. I mean, their break-even price is extremely
Yeah.
high. None of what we see in the next year or two suggests that they'll ever meet the break-even price, fiscal break-even price. But I think they're trying to hit the operational break-even price for a lot of American producers as well. That's something which we tend to forget, and I think that's where they compete with the Americans, particularly as Trump was saying, pump, pump, pump. I think he will find that a lower price will hurt the domestic industry in the United States, and that is a Saudi push for more market share, I think, and they're willing to bite the bullet in the short term, hoping that in the long run they have a more dominance on the market. I'm not sure that's a gamble that will play off because, as we were talking about the JCPOA 2.0. We might see a lifting of sanctions potentially in a couple of years' time, which means there will be more Iranian oil coming online as well. At a time when demand is not necessarily increasing, we'll have more supply. And again, that will add to, I think, lowering prices.
Yeah, I mean that's another reason people are putting behind Saudi. Why is OPEC Plus or some members in it now doing what they're doing? Because in a couple of years we could have a solution to the Iranian equation. Although, and also, even more immediately, sanctions could tighten on Iran and justify and warrant those extra volumes as well. And as you said, market share also in an era where many people are saying peak oil will happen within the next 10 years. So why not make the most of it? On the Iranian side, Dr. Andreas, and sanctions, I mean, we've got the JCPOA side. And of course, in return, Iran wants relief, right? Economic relief. It's under extreme economic pressure domestically, politically, domestically. That is obviously having an impact. How much do you think that is playing a part in the regime's openness to doing a deal with the JCPOA? It's pure economics, isn't it? They need that. Does the regime need that to survive? Where do you see that thinking?
The Iranians are probably the most resilient regime in the world, certainly in this part of the world. I mean, they've gone, 40, more than 5, almost 5 decades of massive sanctions. But they've reached a breaking point now. We have a simmering revolution inside the country. There's massive mobilization, despite the fact that we're not seeing at the moment massive protests. I mean, there is a massive alienation among ordinary Iranians with that regime. They want regime change essentially, and that doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of the Islamic Republic altogether, but it could mean some sort of reforms. And I'm quite skeptical that this regime can reform. But my point being is, it is mostly about socioeconomics. The Iranians are doing very poorly, and that is due to sanctions, but it's due to corruption. So the regime needs it both. I mean, on the one hand, the regime requires the IRGC, which I see as some sort of part of a military dictatorship, to survive through getting access to global markets. At the moment, it's all through access to black markets via potentially the UAE as well, to get access to markets in order to stay alive. Once sanctions are lifted, that can be expanded. That means that sort of nepotistic military dictatorship on that side can stay alive. But at the same time, there will be a trickle down to the middle classes, in particular in Iran, who are now saying, we can't live like this anymore. And so regime survival very much depends on bringing that oil online, getting some money into the country. It's not just oil, by the way; it's also LNG. I remember in 2015 when the first JCPOA was discussed. A lot of Gulf countries were saying we can invest in what is a very, very antiquated gas market, and the infrastructure is antiquated. It needs to be reformed. I can see Qatar Energy, for example, or Qatari companies investing in Iran, particularly in this
Mm.
what they call South Pass, to expand production there. And I think for Gulf countries, there's again, it's competition, but it's also a lot of opportunity there to once sanctions are lifted to help the Iranians bringing also gas online and bringing oil online as well. And I think that's another sort of element of consensus building on both sides of the Gulf where you can cooperate to increase and deepen partnership.
Yeah, and I mean, when you mention LNG and gas, of course, Russia is one of those gas producers, and it's at least its supplies to Europe. The pipeline supplies have been curtailed to a large extent in the last couple of years, and we've seen US LNG take that space and fill that gap, and you've got other backups such as Qatar. I mean, where do you see? Just to ask you, if we see a Russia Ukraine. First of all, do you see a Russia-Ukraine peace deal as viable this year? And if we were theoretically to see that, what would Europe's stance be, you're based in Europe, be towards taking more Russian gas again at the
Great
right price?
question. Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I'm not as optimistic on a Ukraine-Russia deal as of now. That's to do with the fact that most NATO countries don't want to deal within the parameters that Trump has suggested. Then again, they don't have a plan B because obviously, doubling down and putting more weapons into Ukraine is not a viable strategy. We see in the UK, in France, most European countries, most of their security policy, defense policy is consumed 90% by Ukraine, which shows they're kind of out of their depth. So some sort of deal is something that everyone favors, but the terms Trump has put on the table are very much not embraced by anyone within Europe. None of the major players in Europe embrace that. We're still a long way away from it. But I think Trump wants a deal no matter what, and it really depends on the Russians of what kind of deal they want. And it seems that the
Mm.
Russians are in the driver's seat. They are more resilient in this war. They can keep on going. They're running a war economy. They're willing to throw their youth as cannon fodder into this war in a way that the Ukrainians at some point can, and where the West will not be willing to do so. In terms of resilience, the Russians can keep it going while the Ukrainians probably can't for an indefinite period of time. So eventually, the only way out of this war, there won't be a military solution. It will be a diplomatic one. And when it comes, we'll have to then go back we have to then consider, we in Europe have to consider our relationship with Russia. I don't think in this generation, though, we'll go back to what it was pre-2022. That includes Germany, obviously in the UK,
Mm.
France. I think the rightful vilification of Russia, or let's say saying Russia is the number one threat to our combined national securities, that is not going to go away anytime soon. I think there is a generation that has grown through this war, even if it's just been 3 years in Europe, who've said, the Russians are the worst threat to our national securities, and that will mean we'll have to make sure that we never ever get
Yeah.
entangled again with the Russians. So disentanglement is going to continue rather than re-entanglement. But if you look at the figures, there's still quite a lot of energy from Russia going into Europe as it is,
Yes.
despite everything. But they're going to wean off that. That's just no way around it, and I think that's good for the Gulf. When it comes to gas in particular, Qatar will benefit from that in the midterm.
And what about then? I mean, I know you're MENA focused, but what about Europe's approach then? That's to Russia and the Russia equation and threat. What about how Europe is positioning itself to the US trade threat and security? If, at the end of the day, the US Trump is at least saying we're not going to guarantee your security anymore either. Uh, so, you better not lawyer up, but arm up. Um, do you feel a shift within Europe, a permanent shift to the fact that it's just got to start taking care of itself in that front?
That's already happening. Again, it will take time to build that capability and capacity to do so. It will probably take a decade. We're seeing massive investments. I mean, Germany is a great example. I mean, they're
Yeah,
looking at €500 billion that they want to invest in the next 10 years in defense. But that's true for the UK. It's true for France. I think we'll probably see a return of conscription. We're going onto a war footing, not necessarily just to fight Russia, but also the kind of the far enemy, which is China, and seeing where they're going, and we need to secure our interests. So the Europeans have no choice, and that's nothing to do with Trump. The disengagement from the Middle East has nothing to do with Trump. The disengagement of from Europe, or at least saying the Europeans have to do more, is also nothing to do with Trump. That is an overall grand strategic shift that we've seen in Washington, And it's a shift that I think is going to continue for quite some time. So the Europeans are well advised to become more self-sufficient. And I think they will come within NATO a more pan-European sort of approach to defense and sourcing as well, sourcing materials, sharing platforms, sharing production lines and so on. That's the way forward. And let's put it that way. I mean, the US is in decline. And it's nothing to do with Trump again. I don't think Trump will be able to reverse the relative decline of the United States. Europe is in decline as well, but there is also an opportunity for Europe. Europe is very close to the Middle East. Europe is very close to Africa. It has relationships that the United States doesn't have. It's not an alien actor. It's not a completely foreign actor to this part of the world, to the MENA region and to Africa, because of colonial ties. And it's now a reciprocal relationship between particularly the Middle East and Europe. And so they can do things more naturally, more organically than the Americans can. While the Americans have always put big dollars, big money, big, weapons and so on into the region, the Europeans will have to find a different way of doing it. And I think they have a different way. I mean, the UK in particular has a very special relationship with most countries in Northern Africa and the Middle East. And I think this kind of gives them a competitive advantage over the United States when it comes to, geopolitics and strategy in this part of the world.
Yeah, the US is in decline. That's a statement. And do you think, just to close up, Dr. Andreas, US is in decline, the dollar is in decline. What's your outlook for the global South economies, emerging economies within that? Do you see this, that we are in a critical shift now going forward of economic dominance shifting east? Maybe not military, that's not in dispute, but has the economic pendulum firmly now swung?
Well, I'm not a great fan of looking only at hard power and looking at territory and military. I mean, that is a 20th century metric for measuring power. I think power is about relationships, it's about networks, about supply chains, it's about how you are integrated in a globally interconnected world and interconnected economy. And here we certainly see new hubs emerging. I mean, the United Arab Emirates are undeniably one of the major hubs in the global economy. They have emerged as such. They through, interdependence in various domains, not just in oil and gas, but obviously AI, tech, commodity trade and whatnot. This certainly is one of many hubs. Then we've got hubs across Africa as well who are emerging, who are competing, who have relationships and networks that the West is not necessarily integrated with. And I think what Europe and the US have to realize is that we live in a
Yeah, you're still here.
Oh, sorry. What we have to realize is that we're living in a multipolar, potentially apolar world where things shift very, very rapidly. And in this sort of world, I mean, the global South will play a disproportionate a role in comparison to where it was even 10 years ago. And so whoever builds that relationship with the global South, that's not just Africa, that's also the Southern hemisphere like South America, it's East Asia, Southeast Asia. Whoever plays a role there will dominate or at least play a dominating role in this kind of world economy. And I think for too long, Europe and the United States have abandoned the global south. And that's true for energy, for resources, but it's also for human capital. And it's for everything that we need to keep the 21st century economy running. The global south is going to grow in terms of size. And I think that we have to wake up here in the West of saying, actually, we're losing ground in terms of the relationships that we used to have in this part of the world. And we better get our act together and engaging with them instead of focusing over, that's my issue is we're focusing too much of our bandwidth on Eastern Europe and Ukraine, which is an important issue for us. But it's not the only issue. And the Russians are operating all over the world, as do the Chinese, who are our other strategic competitors. So if we don't get our act together and work in the global south, we're going to lose out.
Dr. Andreas Krieg, Director of MENA Analytica, thanks so much for joining us today on Halftime Talk. It's been great to have your perspectives.
Thank you for having me.